I haven't seen a TED, so I don't know whether I'm doing it properly. Whilst we're here, if we could swoosh the next screen up, this will show you what Locality is about. And I'm going to give you some headlines about community rights, which are enshrined in the Localism Act, which is a piece of government legislation from the Coalition 3 or 4 years ago. We are providing advice and information and support to community groups that are wanting to make use of one or other of the community rights of the Localism Act. It's based on our own experience as a membership organisation with members from the sector, from the community lodge sector, who form Locality, including settlements, social action centres, development trusts, social enterprises. Switch on to the next slide, please. Here we are, community rights to build, next one, to bid, to challenge, next one, to boldly go, I feel like saying, but that's not quite right here. I am in Milton Keynes, and I do remember that some of the Superman's movies were shot here, and it feels ever so slightly. Next slide, please. The right to build is about giving opportunities to community groups and community organisations to build small-scale, site-specific developments, not needing planning permission. It's a parallel process to planning permission. It's a legal route securing development that is small-scale, etc. It's mostly related to housing, but could involve community buildings, individuals, and beauty centres, etc. And there's a grant program associated with it. We're on the next slide already. I shouldn't have been about that. I'll be about that next time. But stay where you are, please. Right to build is like neighbourhood planning. There's a link to neighbourhood planning. I guess probably some of you are already familiar with the neighbourhood planning processes and maybe engaging in neighbourhood planning in different parts of the Keynes area, including parks, etc., in the some of the villages. The link between the right to build and neighbourhood planning is that there is a process of community engagement, discussion, dialogue, and ultimately power given by the community for the building or development to go ahead via a referendum. The neighbourhood planning process works very similarly, and in one or two places up and down the country, community groups are enabling a comprehensive redevelopment of services and facilities, usually sports centres, village halls and so on in their community, as part of a neighbourhood plan. The village I'm thinking of is a place called Slapham in Sussex. I'm not going to give you a slide about that one, we can find it on the website. Here we are, opportunities. Next slide, please. Revenue generated stays within the community. Under the right to build, the community group is responsible for securing the land, finding the funding, and developing a housing scheme or developing a mixed-use scheme. Next slide takes advantage of community infrastructure levy and the new homes bonus, which are additional benefits from government to developments in certain areas. Next slide, please. Encourages community spirit and ownership, and also, moving on, encourages partnerships with developers. So some of the nasty things that we sometimes dislike about development provides some opportunities within the right to build. Let's move on to the next slide. There are some challenges too. The legislation says you can only develop sites with up to 5 to 10 houses and the maximum number is 20 dwellings, so it's quite small scale. Next slide. The community acquires the land and capital. That can represent a challenge for the community group, and in particular its negotiation, its legal form, its ability to engage with large-scale funders, social investors, etc. Next slide. There's a grant program supporting this which applies in very narrow circumstances, so it makes it quite hard for an emerging community group to do some of the work it needs to do. Hang on again. And it may just be easy to go down the route of getting planning permission. Referendum is a lot of effort to go to, and it wouldn't necessarily provide a positive result. So, moving on. Let's talk about the community right to bid. And the signpost here says community right to buy. Because the original driver for this legislation is legislation in Scotland, where communities in the Highlands and Islands and the remoter rural areas have got rights in Shrine legislation to purchase land and assets that are either owned by S&T landowners or put on the market for sale for large amounts of money, and the community has the first right to buy. Unfortunately, in England, we have conservative small c, which says careful, conservative forces that are at work, and the community right to buy became community right to bid. That's the only movement on the screen, apart from the swoosh. Community right to bid, as it now is, and that's a result of the effort put in by the Country Land and Business Association to water down the legislation. So we move on. The right to bid gives opportunities to community groups to pause the sale of land or buildings, and gives an opportunity for appropriately constituted community groups to have an asset registered and to have an opportunity to purchase it. The owner can sell to a community group during the period, may not sell on the open market. Let's move on. And there we are, there's the headline. The right to bid aims to ensure that buildings and units can be kept in public use and remain an integral part of community life. How do we go about selling an asset list? Swoosh. The local authority lists assets of community value. Assets may be public or private or voluntary sector owned, so the charitable trust owning property could have buildings listed. Moving on, the nominating body can be a parish or town council, an established local community group, a community council, a locally connected voluntary community group. Moving on, once the local authority lists, so it's Milton Keynes Borough Council in this part of the world. In the two-tier areas of the country, it's still the lower tier council, so it's the district council or the borough council up and down the country, and in unitary areas, it's the single authority that does the listing. The local authority must inform the owner and the organisation nominating, and the local authority must also inform the occupier of the building. The local authority has to respond to an appeal by the landowner. The nominating organisation, the community group, is not able to appeal a decision if the local authority says we're not listing it. The listing, when it happens, will take place for 5 years. So a building like a park or a shop, if it's listed by the local authority, it remains listed as an asset of community value for 5 years, giving opportunities throughout that period for community groups to be considered as a purchaser. Swoosh. So, community value, how is it defined? Swoosh again. It must further the social well-being or cultural, recreational, sporting interests of the local community. It's quite critical in terms of how a nomination is phrased and formed. The community group will need to focus on those key parts of what the building brings to cultural, social, sporting and environmental life. Moving. It must have a principal use. So, if you're nominating a car park that sits around the building, and you're nominating only the car park, it probably wouldn't fit the criteria. If you see the opportunity of the car park to generate revenue and income for your organisation, as many community groups have done so, you actually have to nominate the whole building. Moving on. And the asset, when nominated, it must be seen as continuing to further the social well-being or interest of the local community. So if you're nominating a building that's about to fall down, or has fallen down, it's less likely to be perceived as furthering the social well-being or interest of the community. Moving on, please. What opportunities are? Number one, it's a legal mechanism to encourage community ownership of assets. And number two, it's owners viewing assets, we hope, it doesn't always work like this, but hope in a completely different way, as a valuable community resource, and recognising that they have got responsibilities to ensure their preservation. There are some interesting test cases and examples which we'll come to in a minute. I'm going to just say very briefly something now about the right to challenge, if you could move on. And the right to challenge, moving on, is a challenge issued by a community group to a local authority, where the local authority is providing a range of services the community group itself thinks it can provide more effectively or efficiently. And by issuing the right to challenge, the community group opens up a procurement process from the local authority around different aspects of the local authority's public services. There are some challenges associated with it, and I'm not going to go over those here, but there's an example we have got a little later on where a community group was actually nominated in the building and is also contracting with a local authority to run a service within that building, and the two rights can work together quite well. Let's move on to some examples. And again, the big picture. There have been 4,500, 5,000 inquiries now that we've dealt with on our advice service, of which many have been about nominating assets, and across the country something like 775 last year. It's more than that now have been nominated, and more than 500 have been listed. The vast range of places that have engaged with this, many of them through work by parish councils, community groups, neighbourhood associations and others. The number of assets there listed, almost 600 now, probably beyond that, more than a quarter of them are public houses, and the Plunkett Foundation and Community Shares Unit have both been quite significantly involved in support for that. Other issues and other places that things have been listed include community libraries or libraries, green spaces up and down the country, sports facilities, football grounds, including Oxford United and Manchester United, not being partisan of course, print shops, churches, hospitals, NHS assets, particularly challenging ones, town halls, a barracks or two in Cornwall, Wincombe Control Tower down in West Berkshire. I'll come back to that in a minute. I'm talking at the present time to a group in Cumbria who want to list the open space on the Saddleback Glen Catherine Moors, which is owned by the Longstones, put them on the market for £2.6 million. And there's quite interesting issues there. Let's move on. There's a map, way down at the bottom, on the right, central, of the number of assets listed up and down the country, almost 800 when we did this map. More than a third of them pretty well in the east of England, so 250 in the east of England, about 100 here in the southeast, 80 odd in the southwest, and 35 in London, and relatively few in the north and the Midlands. That will change with time, but the traction of this programme has been mostly south of England. Moving on. Some key trends. One of the descriptions in the legislation about assets must have a recent past use, represents some challenges. So if you're coming to a redundant school building that's not been in school form for 5 years or more, the local authority is not necessarily going to see positively it can list it within the scope of the Act. The owner appeals issue I referred to earlier, there have been quite a few appeals by owners of pubs and breweries and Bowling Green in one case in Bexhill-on-Sea, and most of those appeals against the decision to list have been lost by the owner and the decision of the local authority has been retained. There are one or two other cases in quite one that make a difference. Third point, some local authorities interpret legislation very onerously and they say, that's only to a group you can list, but you must demonstrate you've got the money. Right? Show us you've got the money now, even though it's not on the market and even though the whole process has not hardly started. And then the 6-month window, which occurred to there, is where a listed asset goes on the market. There's a 6-week and then a 6-month window for open market sales and boards. To give the community the opportunity to buy. It's pretty challenging to raise the sort of money you need in order to buy a pub or a shop or a community centre or a school. And that to bank out through £2.6 million in a relatively short time might be a big challenge. Typically, community groups need help and support in building their organisational form, developing their business plan, developing their structure, governance, etc., etc. That all is going to take time. Swoosh. There's the library, an example down at the bottom. That's the library in Council Rise in the London Borough of Brent. It's an interesting example because the building was owned and still is owned by All Souls College, Oxford. And a lot of that part of Brent is actually owned by All Souls College, Oxford. And it was listed successfully by a community campaign. The local planning authority has an option within the legislation to consider whether or not the fact that the building that's been listed means it shouldn't be demolished. And in this case, All Souls College said we want to build an awesome world-class engineering exciting chunk of housing with a very small community room for a community library. And the planning decision was not to allow that to go forward, and they quoted the listing of the asset of community value in the decision. And I think that was challenged by All Souls because it was successful. Swoosh, please. Here's an example. Here's an example. This is the first ever asset to be listed up and down the country. It's in South London. It's the Ivy House pub in Nunhead. It was notorious and an excellent venue for all sorts of reasons, including injury and the blockheads performing there. It was bought from the pub company by a developer who wanted to turn the upper floors into housing or flats, and also the same on the ground floor. It's a grade 2 building of architectural interest, and there was a community campaign to get it listed. And they succeeded. And not only did they succeed, but they succeeded in creating a structure, a legal framework, a loan system, grants, processes for employing people, and taking it over £2.6 million for that set in the space of about 6 months. There are other people here who have been involved in that campaign, so we might be able to talk about that at lunchtime. Swoosh, one more. And here's another example. It's a rural example, and I said earlier, Green Common. Green Common, iconic place for all sorts of reasons from the 60s and is US Air Force base used for retaining bombers that would depart in the wars in the 70s and 80s, and the land inalienable but not accessible. And over time, the US Air Force is gone, the base is gone, the Air Force buildings are some of these still there. The Green Control Tower was listed by the Structural Council, with the Parish Council seeing an opportunity of creating a visitor centre, interpretation, heritage centre, looking at the history of the common as well as the air base, and also providing others. Early days to say how successful these assets are going to be in community ownership, because there's still relatively new legislation, but we're keeping an eye on it, and the legislation obviously is continuing for the time being. It may change with review in 4 or 5 years' time. It all helps with the transfer of interested land buildings from public stroke, private stroke, other sectors to community sectors. Swoosh, moving on, please. Any more help? Any more advice? And again, please go to the council website. And again, please go to the community rights website, and you'll find a telephone number at local 48 0300 1864. Any more? That's it. Thank you very much.